I don't think you ever recuperate from something like this.
I was in a state of shock, a complete state of total hysteria.
But to not really have any kind of explanation was a living hell.
I said, "Do you think I did this?"
A doctor is brutally murdered, and when the police can't track down their only suspect, a son takes matters into his own hands.
I just made the promise to him that I wasn't going to come back until I found the person who did this.
Then, a young man is shot down in cold blood, and the only people who seem to know anything about it are nowhere to be found.
One thing about my son, he always knew I would always have his back.
What happened? It's hard to believe. I know in my heart he shot.
Let it go unsolved.
Open
Figure out who did that.
the investigation.
I needed
There is
justice.
crucial information. Nobody deserves.
October 24th, 2006. It's a seemingly ordinary evening in a downtown Chicago office building, and dermatologist Dr. David Cornbleet is getting ready to go home, just as he's done for the last 20 years. 12 floors below, a young man quietly enters the elevator.
It just was pretty obvious that he was trying to conceal himself from being identified.
The man walks into Dr. Cornbleet's empty office. There is no receptionist on duty or patients left waiting. As the doctor greets the man, he is met with a knife. The attacker leaves Dr. Cornbleet alone and dying on his office floor. An hour after he was due home, the doctor's family begins to wonder where he is.
My dad was incredibly methodical, almost obsessive compulsive. At about 6 o'clock, he would call my mom, tell her he was coming home, and it was the same every single day.
But tonight, there is no phone call to his wife, and Dr. Cornbleet doesn't come home.
It was about 7:15. I called my sister who lived in the city and said, "Hey, can you run down to Dad's office? Mom is a little bit concerned."
As Jocelyn races to her father's building, her mind is spinning. When she gets to his office door, she finds it unlocked.
His waiting room was the same. There was nothing tossed around. It was just very still. And so I walked down the hallway to the last room. When I turned, the middle room had blood all across the doorway, streaked across it almost as if a hand had brushed up against it and left a staining of blood on it.
What Jocelyn is about to see next will haunt her for the rest of her life.
I remember that my dad, when I tried to open the door, was laying right behind it. He was wearing his lab coat. The room was completely disheveled. I do remember calling 911 and having a hard time explaining what I wanted to say. I felt like overwhelmed and mumbled.
Jocelyn now has to make the hardest phone call she's ever made.
I called my mom and I told her that I was at Dad's office and that Dad was dead.
Shaken to the core, Jocelyn pulls it together long enough to make one more call to her older brother, John.
I got a phone call from my sister and she said, "Dad's dead." And I said, "What happened? Was it a stroke? What's going on here?" And she said, "He was murdered."
John immediately jumps in his car and heads to his father's office building. In the meantime, the police arrive and begin to scour the crime scene for clues.
I think at the initial stage, nobody really knew what had happened. I think one of the things we had ruled out immediately was that it was a robbery. There was a significant amount of money in his pockets. There were multiple defensive wounds on him, too.
Dr. David Cornbleet died from more than 20 stab wounds. He was just 64 years old.
I was the one who identified his body. It was one of the worst scenes I've ever... I still have nightmares about that image.
While the weapon is nowhere to be found, the detectives go through the evidence left by the doctor's body, a blowtorch and other seemingly random hardware items. They also take samples of blood, not just from the body, but also the floor and door to check for DNA. While Jocelyn and John struggle to keep it all together, the police try to make sense of the gruesome scene.
And then they started talking to us individually and asking questions such as, why did you decide to come here? And why did you do it at this time? And I turned to the detective who was asking me and I said, do you think I did this?
It's not unusual for family members to be questioned first, but the police quickly dismiss John and Jocelyn as suspects. When it comes to a motive, however, the Cornbleets and the police are completely clueless.
My dad was the kind of person who didn't have any enemies. His patients absolutely adored him.
But it isn't long before a suspect begins to emerge. Within hours, the police track down a potential witness who may have seen the man who killed their father.
Somebody rode down the elevator actually with him and remarked to the security guard that there was somebody in the elevator acting very suspiciously. He was breathing very heavily. He had blood all over him.
Police immediately scan through the office building's surveillance video and spot a young man who fits the witness's description to a T.
When you look at the surveillance initially, you see a young guy walking into a building. He's definitely trying to conceal himself. And then when you see him leave the building, he has a different hat on.
You had a witness who rode down with him in the elevator. It was like everything you possibly need for a clean-cut case, we had, except for the motive.
But to not really have any kind of explanation as to what happened was a living hell.
The Cornbleets cannot fathom why anyone would want to murder their honest, hardworking father. It is a devastating blow to the close-knit family, so devastating that their mother, Eileen, won't even speak about it. Her husband of 38 years is gone.
Grew up in what I thought was pretty much a TV family.
David Cornbleet and Eileen Hirsch were married in 1968 and settled in the suburbs of Chicago. They had 2 children, first Jonathan, then Jocelyn.
My father and I had daddy-daughter weekend. I would know to look forward to the Saturday after Thanksgiving. That was going to be just our day together.
My father and I were best friends. I actually was named Jonathan because in the Bible, Jonathan and David were the best of friends.
Heartbroken, all the family can do is begin preparations for Dr. Cornbleet's funeral.
Preparing to bury my father was incredibly difficult. The last image that, I have of him is when I saw him laying in his office, stabbed.
On a cold autumn afternoon in October 2006, Dr. David Cornbleet is laid to rest. John lingers behind, waiting for everyone to leave so he can be alone with his father one last time.
Well, after he was buried, I just wanted to be the last one to leave. I just made the promise to him that right then and there that I wasn't going to come back until I found the person that did this.
Dr. David Cornbleet, a Chicago dermatologist, has been brutally murdered, stabbed to death more than 20 times in his office. Armed with a surveillance video of the alleged killer, the police have a huge lead, but locating the mysterious man is proving to be a lot harder than anyone thought. Cook County District Attorney Bernie Murray is the prosecutor assigned to the case.
It was in his office on North Michigan Avenue, an area where you would expect any crime to happen, frankly. So when his murder happened, it was all over the news.
It seems as if all of Chicago knows his father has been murdered, but no one is able to ID the mystery man in the video. And as days turn into weeks, John becomes more and more frustrated.
I looked at the surveillance video maybe 500 times within the first few months. And just, you'd pick up little things every day. I badly wanted to figure out who he was.
John begins to wonder if the surveillance video can be enhanced, but the detectives don't have the necessary technology in-house, and their budget is strapped. If John wants to see more, he'll have to do it himself.
I found a company via the internet. They were a company outside of Washington, D.C. of a couple former FBI agents, and they greatly enhanced the video.
The man's face is still obscured, but now John has a clearer picture of the suspect's figure.
We were dealing with a man either in his late teens to early 20s or in their mid-20s.
With that information, Dan Drucker, John's brother-in-law, has an idea that he hopes will turn the case on its head.
Just understanding that type of demographic, we know that this community lives online. And this is where they interact.
In a bold step, John and Dan build a webpage within a social networking site dedicated to finding Dr. Cornbleet's killer. They start by posting images from the surveillance video and a contact number for the Chicago police, hoping that someone will recognize the man in the elevator.
His idea was you get people communicating and you get almost like a chain where you get people passing the message on to the next person and to the next person. And I mean, in theory, I mean, the idea was brilliant.
The floodgates open. It absolutely exploded.
Within days, the website triggers hundreds of responses, but no significant leads.
We were getting a lot of hits, just basically people telling us how sorry they were. You never really want to give up hope, and I always kept my faith alive that the case would break at a point.
2 months after the tragic night, John has become a valuable part of the investigation into his father's death, and the Chicago police decide to share with him a critical clue.
It was a couple of months into the investigation when the detectives had said to us that they had this piece of evidence that was found at the scene that they thought was absolutely critical and that they could trace it back to one particular place.
The piece of evidence, which the police asked John not to discuss publicly, is a hardware item that the killer left behind at the crime scene. In fact, it's still in its original packaging with the store's name on it. One by one, police canvass the local outlets, checking purchase records from the days preceding the murder. Investigators then match the time on the receipts to the store's surveillance video. It isn't long before they pinpoint a customer who seems to match the description of the bloody man in the elevator.
There was somebody who had fit the description of the assailant, and that's, I think, why the police started honing in as this as a potential suspect.
John can't help but wonder, is this the same man in the elevator who police believe stabbed his father to death?
I know talking to John every night about it, he wanted to believe it so much that this was the same guy.
I'll be honest, when I saw this tape, I thought this is definitely gonna lead to somebody. The picture on the tape is so clear, and I thought, this is it.
The first video was hard to read, but this one is much clearer, and John knows exactly what to do with it. Posted on the website that he's created to help solve his father's murder.
I thought that for sure somebody was going to recognize him.
With not one, but two images of his father's killer, John becomes obsessed with finding the mystery man. He ups the ante by making flyers with the new images and posting a $25,000 reward.
I had basically a flyer in almost every storefront near and around within a 3-mile radius of that. I'm checking the website every day, a couple times a day. That basically was when I was at home or during my free time, that's what I was doing.
Well, the weeks started to pass. I think we all started to get a little less optimistic. It became much bleaker because here we have everything resting on this one video and nothing, no one's coming forward.
4 months go by, and then in April, John gets a call from one of the detectives with some startling news. The man in the hardware store video has just walked into the police station.
He identified himself off of a flyer, and then from there contacted the police. He had a solid alibi and cleared his name immediately.
Suddenly, John and his family find themselves back at square one.
That was a heavy blow to the case.
It's really hard to remain so passionate about finding this person when you're just hitting dead ends constantly. I think you lose a lot of hope.
After 6 months on the case, John and Jocelyn are beginning to doubt whether they'll ever be able to solve their father's murder. But then, when they least expect it, John receives a clue that could potentially crack the case wide open.
And I get an email that says, "Jonathan, do not delete."
For more than 6 months, John Cornbleet has been obsessed with tracking down the man who viciously murdered his father, Dr. David Cornbleet. But John has turned to the web for help, and now it looks like his high-tech strategy is about to pay off. Out of the blue, he receives a shocking email from a stranger.
I was very excited and just basically says, I believe that I have knowledge of who this person is, why he did it, and I would really like to talk to you. And he had known a few things about the case that I had never let out to the media.
John can barely contain himself. He picks up the phone to call the man who claims to know his father's killer, and soon discovers that he's a Marine just returned from fighting in Iraq.
He had said to me he had met with his friend that night and that his friend was very almost scared in a sense. And the friend had said, I think that I know about a murder from my former roommate.
The Marine is confident that the killer is a man named Hans Peterson, who is currently living in New York City.
And he had asked me if I knew who it was. I said, I have no idea who that was.
And as soon as this name was dropped, the police went to, the medical records and saw the name, and eventually right from there, the dots started connecting.
It actually was a former patient of my father.
While family members grapple with this new development, the Chicago detectives focus on finding their father's former patient.
Police officers continue their investigation by conducting interviews in New York City of Hans Peterson's former roommate.
They described him as somebody who was extremely antisocial, who had a lot of different issues.
It soon becomes clear that Hans Peterson is a troubled young man who suffered from depression since childhood. But Peterson himself became convinced that his troubles didn't begin until after Dr. David Cornbleet prescribed him an acne medicine back in 2002.
He had claimed that he had all these side effects from the drug. And he had taken the drug 2 times. And my dad, basically had said to him, you're having a reaction. If this is the case, you need to get off it immediately and come back in here. And he had never come back into the office.
Peterson stops taking the medication, but insists that it's damaged him forever. Writing in an online forum, he states, I went to see a dermatologist for my mild but persistent acne. He was an unethical old man. My ears started to ring. My libido vanished. For the family, it's almost too far-fetched to believe.
I've had numerous friends, even under my father's guidance, taking this drug, so it wasn't a drug that was foreign to me in any way, and it was a drug that's extremely familiar to the public. It wasn't something where I was like, wow, why would he have prescribed this medication?
The police secure a search warrant and begin combing through Peterson's belongings. They leave with cigarette butts, hoping for a DNA sample.
After the Chicago Police Department detectives returned from New York City, evidence was submitted to the Illinois State Police Crime Lab in an effort to determine if Hans Peterson's DNA matched an unknown profile found at the crime scene.
Police speculate that in his struggle to kill Dr. Cornbleet, Peterson was also injured, leaving behind a critical clue, his own blood. 6 weeks later, the findings come in. The DNA obtained in Peterson's apartment is a positive match to DNA at the crime scene.
I was just so disgusted to learn about him because it was real at that moment.
District Attorney Murray now has all the evidence he needs, and in June of 2007, a warrant is issued for Hans Peterson's arrest. But just when the Cornbleets are sure their struggle for personal justice is finally over, the police drop a bombshell. Hans Peterson has fled to a Caribbean island.
When we first found out that he had fled, I think that all of us thought he easily could come back to the United States.
But what Jocelyn doesn't realize is that they are about to enter a tangled web of international politics. And once again, John Cornbleet feels compelled to take matters into his own hands.
He's basically given us the middle finger to say, I'll do whatever I want there. I was going to go down there myself and settle the score with Hans.
For the past 6 months, John Cornbleet has dedicated every waking moment to tracking down the man who killed his father. And now, John thinks he's found him. The only problem, the alleged killer, Hans Peterson, has escaped to a small Caribbean island beyond U.S. jurisdiction.
Well, the FBI got involved. We had just thought, okay, it's a matter of time before he's brought back here.
Hearing that he was in St. Martin, we knew it would be different.
In order to arrest Peterson, District Attorney Bernie Murray must request a warrant with the United States Department of Justice. But while Murray is waiting for the paperwork to go through, Peterson makes a bold and decisive move. He confesses to the crime and turns himself in to the French authorities.
When Hans Peterson surrendered himself to the French gendarmes, he also told them that his mother was born in France, and he was claiming his French citizenship. This was obviously a calculated move by him to avoid coming back to the United States and facing American jurisprudence and American justice.
It seems like a slap in the face, actually, of the United States legal system, that someone can just choose one day that they like the benefits of one system over the other, so that's it. They're gonna be French.
With Peterson's confession comes the most painful part of it all, the details of exactly how he planned and carried out the murder of Dr. David Cornbleet. For 4 years, Peterson plots his revenge. Then on the night of October 24th, he acts.
From the forensic evidence that was collected, it was obvious to us that Hans Peterson had targeted Dr. Cornbleet.
Having visited the doctor's office before, Peterson knows that there was no receptionist, and to avoid witnesses, he makes sure he's the last patient of the day.
He was using stuff to open the doors, to cover his fingerprints, cover himself from getting DNA on things.
Posing as a patient, Peterson follows the doctor into an exam room and then brutally attacks him.
He claims that he didn't intend to kill him, that he was going to torture him and get back at him.
In his confession, Peterson tells police that he wanted to cut off the doctor's hands and cauterize them with a blowtorch.
Knowing my father, I knew that he wouldn't just surrender to somebody.
Indeed, the doctor puts up a much bigger fight than expected, punching his assailant and leaving Peterson bloodied as well. But by the time he's finished, Peterson has stabbed Dr. Cornbleet more than 20 times.
It made me very sick to my stomach.
For the Cornbleets, hearing the details of the crime makes Peterson's escape even more unbearable. But the French refused to turn Peterson over to the United States, remaining firm that he be tried by their own judicial system.
We thought 100% guarantee he'd be prosecuted in Chicago and in Cook County. So to finally realize that he was not going to be prosecuted here was devastating.
Today, Hans Peterson sits in a prison in Guadeloupe, awaiting trial by a French judge. The Cornbleets are relieved to know that their father's killer is behind bars, but their quest for justice won't be over until Hans Peterson pays the maximum penalty for his act of rage.
I still hold out hope that he's going to be punished here someday. I don't think you ever recuperate from something like this. I know that I sure haven't. I mean, not a day goes by where I don't think about my father.
The Cornbleet family, it's not a family who's going to sit on the sidelines and let the events sweep past them.
In some sense, I think my dad is extremely proud of us. He feels like we did him justice.
For the Cornbleets, a trail of evidence eventually led them to their father's killer. But what if there is no evidence to a crime, and the only witnesses won't talk? February 4th, 2001. It's just after midnight, and 25-year-old Michael Lee and his girlfriend are on their way to a trailer park in Ashland, California.
This trailer park was in an impoverished area. It was pretty creepy.
Michael has come to visit a friend. He doesn't plan to stay long, though, so he pulls up next to the trailer and tells his girlfriend to stay in the car.
Michael proceeded up a few short steps to the front door of the trailer park.
But as he waits for his friend to answer the door, he's confronted by someone he wasn't expecting.
A short time later, gunshots were heard, and Michael fell to the ground.
Early the next morning, Michael's mother, Tammy Capilano, is woken by a knock at her door. It's the police.
I went to the door. He asked me if I was the mother of Michael Corey Lee. He said, I need to tell you, your son has been a victim of a homicide, and he's dead. All I could say is no. You have the wrong person.
My mom just kind of fell. And she started just becoming hysterical.
I was in a state of shock. I was in a complete state of total hysteria.
Tammy's son, Michael Corey Lee, leaves behind his mother, 2 sisters, and a 3-year-old daughter.
The next few days after we found out that my brother died they were really hard. I pretty much passed my time by just doing whatever my mom needed.
Still numb from the news, Tammy makes her way to the Alameda Sheriff's Office to find out exactly what happened that fateful night.
He told me that there was no forensics, there were no ballistics, there was no weapon. They told me that there were witnesses, but that they were not offering any information whatsoever.
And even worse, the main witness to the shooting, Michael's girlfriend, has disappeared, and no one has any idea where she is. The detectives are cautious about revealing the details of the crime, but they do ask Tammy a puzzling question.
They asked me if I had ever heard of a Joker of Dakota. I told them I don't know of anybody by that name. This person has never been mentioned by my son, ever.
According to police sources, word on the street is that a man named Joker of Dakota knows something about Michael's murder.
When I left the sheriff's department, they told me they would do everything that they could, and I had total faith in them.
Tammy is counting on them to answer a laundry list of troubling questions. Who is this Joker person? How is he connected to Michael's case? Who ultimately pulled the trigger? And why would anyone want to murder her only son?
I was in oblivion. I had no information whatsoever.
Overwhelmed by the tragic turn of events, Tammy's attention turns to the preparations for Michael's funeral.
After the funeral, he was cremated immediately. And one thing about my son, he always knew if anything happened to him, that I would never, ever let it go unsolved, that I would always have his back. So I kept his ashes on my fireplace mantel, and I promised him I would not let him go until whoever took his life was in prison for the rest of their life.
In the days following Michael's funeral, Tammy patiently waits for word on the detective's progress. But as time passes, she begins to grow restless.
I was calling there once a week, every week, asking for information, asking where they had gone with their investigation. I was getting, we're still working on it, we can't tell you anything, but if we get somebody in custody, we'll give you a call. And I said, that's not quite good enough for me.
Tammy doesn't understand why they can't tell her anything more about this Joker of Dakota, who she now believes had something to do with Michael's murder.
I figured if he didn't do it, he knew who did. And I decided one day that if the police weren't going to look for him, I was.
Now, armed with the only clue she has, Tammy decides to take matters into her own hands. It's a decision that will send her into some of the most dangerous neighborhoods on the West Coast.
I didn't see the change in me that my family did, but they noticed that I wasn't the mom that they had at home anymore. Their mom was going out in the streets. I needed justice for myself. I needed justice for my son's daughter. There is no way I was going to let that little girl grow up not knowing that whoever killed her father was in prison or not.
Tammy Capilano's son, Michael Lee, was shot to death in the winter of 2001, but after 6 long months, the investigation seems to be at a standstill. And the thought of Michael's killer walking free is driving Tammy mad.
I couldn't sit there and not have a voice. I couldn't sit there and not be proactive. I was really determined to find Michael's killer, and I was not going to let this go unsolved.
Determined to help solve the case, Tammy makes a fateful decision. She's going to scour the gang-infested streets south of Oakland to try and locate the one man who may just hold the key to the case, It's a job she spent a lifetime preparing for. In her youth, Tammy was a member of a motorcycle gang in Oregon, and when Michael was born, Tammy was barely out of high school.
I had him when I had just turned 17. It was pretty much he and myself, and it was a very hard life, but Michael and I were really, really close.
Then Tammy married and moved south of Oakland, California to an affordable neighborhood, but one teeming with gangs.
As much as I tried to get Michael out of that lifestyle, Michael was really drawn in by that crowd.
The one thing Tammy thought might save Michael was his love of drawing, which ultimately led to a career as a tattoo artist.
My brother got into tattooing when he was hanging out with the kids in Westside Berkeley. They all saw how well he could draw.
Michael soon got a job at a tattoo parlor and seemed to be on the straight and narrow. But the company he was keeping and the temptation to turn a quick buck was hard to escape.
He started getting involved in things that basically no parent's proud of. He got into meth, and he got into a lot of illegal activities, some of which he ended up doing jail time for.
In 1998, Michael served 9 months in prison for forging checks and creating fake IDs. That same year, at age 22, he became a father. The baby was the light of Michael's life, and at that point, he made a decision to try and keep out of trouble.
When my brother's daughter was born, he was so excited. He loved her so much.
He was a good father, but Michael also had another side of him, which was easy street.
As much as he tried to turn his life around, Michael kept getting pulled back to the dark side. And when Tammy discovers that Michael's developed a full-blown drug habit, she explodes.
I told my son he had to leave home because my son, I felt, in my opinion, was not doing what he needed to do to take care of his daughter, to be a good father, to be productive as a citizen.
Michael's checkered past gives rise to all sorts of questions. Could the shooting have been the result of a beef with one of his more unsavory associates? Or was Michael simply in the wrong place at the wrong time?
The police had asked me what I thought might have been a motive behind Michael's death. And at that time, I didn't know all of the extent of the things my son was doing.
Not knowing is torture for Tammy, but even more agonizing is the way she left things with her only son.
Michael and I were on the outs when he died, and I wasn't talking to him. That's regret I live with every day.
Robbed of the chance for reconciliation, Tammy has now taken on the most difficult and dangerous job of her life: to find her son's killer.
My son may have been a screw-up, but that was my son. That was my boy. I started out, in my mind, at the most basic of places, at the tattoo shops where my son worked.
I didn't really want her doing that, because it did put her in danger.
I just hit the streets in the areas where my son hung out. I talked to his friends. Nobody wanted to give me any detailed information. I could tell from looking at them, they were afraid.
The gang world is notorious for its code of silence and retribution, and Tammy's family is worried that if Michael's death was indeed gang-related, then her quest for justice could put her own life at risk.
I wasn't thinking of family anymore, and I wasn't thinking about being a mom anymore to my children that I had. I was so afraid to love my children, because what happens if something happens to them now? I don't think I could stand losing another child.
After weeks of searching for information about the Joker of Dakota or any other clue to Michael's killer, Tammy realizes that there's only one place left to investigate: the crime scene itself.
When I went to the trailer park and started knocking on doors, asking people if they knew anything that happened that night that maybe I needed to know, they didn't have to tell the police, but could you please tell me, did you see anything? Did you hear anything? It was just a really eerie feeling, because I knew everybody in that park knew something. Somebody had to know something, and yet nobody was talking.
It's been 2 years since Michael's murder, and Tammy is at another dead end. In desperation, she checks back with the police investigators, but they too have nothing to report. For the first time, Tammy begins to wonder if she will ever know who killed her only son.
I had lost so much faith. I was pretty much just had a defeatist attitude about the whole thing.
Then, just when her quest for justice has reached a standstill, Tammy gets some unexpected news. A new detective has been assigned to the investigation.
I didn't have a lot of hope. I thought, oh, they're going to assign somebody less qualified, less capable, and less interested.
But Detective Scott Dudek brings something new to the table. He's worked years in narcotics before moving into the homicide unit, and unlike his predecessors, he's ready to take on Tammy.
My normal procedure is when I start an investigation, it's important to get the family members involved. It's very important to let the family members know where the investigation's at, what's been done, how far it's been done.
He told me exactly what his moves were going to be. He said, look, I need to read the case and find out exactly what happened. I'm going to start canvassing and talking to the witnesses again.
But little does Tammy know that Detective Dudek's plans are about to pay off in spades.
I did get a phone call from Scott Dudek. He said, Tammy, this is going to break the case wide open.
Tammy Capilano has spent the past 2 years on the hunt for her son's killer. Michael's case has gone cold, but now she has a new ally in the police department, Detective Scott Dudek.
I had a lot of confidence that this case could be solved.
Detective Dudek decides that the only way to find Michael's killer is to rely on witnesses in the trailer park the night of the murder. Dudek tells Tammy they have to track down Michael's girlfriend, who was with him and has since disappeared.
Scott found out that this guy, Joker, had put a contract out on her and wanted her dead. She hit the streets and she started running.
Tammy has always suspected that someone nicknamed the Joker of Dakota had something to do with Michael's murder, and now Detective Dudek believes that this witness might be coaxed out of hiding with Tammy's help.
I had success in having vigils to try to get media attention. Tammy put the whole thing together.
It kind of gave me a path where to put my anger and my pain and my loss.
Tammy gets permission to hold a candlelight vigil at the trailer park where Michael had been shot. She buys all the candles and makes flyers to hand out.
I was really hoping that the media would cover the story and that somebody would come forward and talk with the sheriff's department.
On February 4th, 2004, 3 years to the day of Michael's murder, dozens of friends and family surround Tammy.
When we had the candlelight vigil, all of the people that Michael knew were there that loved him a lot. And I know they were touched by it, and I was touched by it, and Mike's daughter was there.
And so was the media, taking a picture of Tammy and Michael's daughter lighting a candle for her father. Everything goes according to plan, but in the days that follow, it becomes clear that the witness still isn't ready to come out of hiding.
I was very frustrated when Scott told me that no tips were coming in.
As it went on, we at least spoke once a week on the phone and met in person at least once a month.
Then on March 17th, 2004, 6 weeks after the vigil, Detective Dudek gets a call that turns the case on its head.
And the witness's attorney just told me, she now wants to talk to you, please go out and talk to her, which I did.
The witness, Michael's girlfriend, was in the car when Michael was shot and killed. She tells Dudek that she came forward after seeing the photo of the candlelight vigil and Michael's little daughter.
That's what made her decide she had to do something to help the police find this man, because his daughter looks just like her father, and she decided she was going to come forward.
Soon, other witnesses are coaxed into talking to the police, and with their help, the role of the mysterious Joker finally becomes clear.
They were able to physically identify the shooter as the Joker.
For nearly 3 years, Tammy tried in vain to locate the Joker of Dakota, and now she finally knows why. The Joker is a high-ranking gang leader named Rafael Cacique.
When I saw a picture of Rafael Cacique, I thought, what a short little punk. Put me in a room with that man for 5 minutes and close the door, and don't look. justice will be done and I'll be okay.
In December of 2005, Rafael Cacique pleads not guilty and his trial begins. It's then that Tammy learns for the first time the exact details of her son's murder. According to witness testimony, on February 4th, 2001, Michael Lee drives to a trailer park around midnight.
When Michael arrived at the trailer park, he was with his then girlfriend who waited in the car when Michael got out. She witnessed this male walk up to Michael. A short time later, gunshots were heard and Michael fell to the ground.
But Michael does not die immediately.
Right after Michael was shot, Michael went just a short distance across the trailer park and kind of collapsed in front of another trailer.
Cacique threatens to kill Michael's girlfriend, and then he flees the scene. For Tammy, the news that her son suffered before his death is shattering, but equally distressing for some friends and family is the motive, or relative lack thereof.
It probably was over money. The motive for the homicide at this point still remains in the air.
It doesn't matter what it was over, it was senseless.
On March 8, 2006, after 2 days of deliberation, the jury comes back with a verdict. Rafael Cacique is found guilty of murder in the first degree of Michael Lee. He's sentenced to 50 years to life in prison, and in a first for California, he is ordered to pay child support from Michael's daughter.
That's when I really cried. That's when I knew that my son knew I had his back.
My mom called me from the courthouse as soon as she heard the verdict, and she told me that it was guilty. And all the emotions that I had on the day that I found out that he died came rushing back to me all at once.
You know, no matter what happens when you're at those trials, you try to stay emotionally detached as much as you can, but, you know, this one meant a lot. Obviously, seeing Ralph Cacique locked up for the rest of his life, it was huge. It was fantastic.
Cacique is currently locked up in Pelican Bay Prison, awaiting the outcome of his appeal.
Tammy really loves Michael a tremendous amount, and it was basically killing her, too, that Michael died until she got some answers.